I can't believe I ever thought you had potential, my girlfriend whispered during her cousin's wedding reception while sitting beside friends who immediately burst out laughing. I smiled, congratulated the newlyweds, and left early. 11 months later, she froze after seeing my name illuminate the main screen at a National Wealth Summit hosted inside a sold-out convention arena. I can't believe I ever thought you had potential. She said it low, like a confession, leaning slightly toward Chelsea with a smirk already forming at the corner of her mouth. And Chelsea laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not an uncomfortable, cover-your-mouth laugh. A full, bright, delighted laugh. The kind that turns heads at tables nearby and makes other people lean in wanting to know the joke. The joke was me. I was sitting right there. Glass of champagne in my hand. Jacket pressed, tie straight. At a wedding reception for Gabrielle's cousin Miranda, surrounded by 40 or 50 people who all knew Gabrielle, who all loved Gabrielle, who had all watched Gabrielle arrive that evening on my arm like I was someone worth arriving with. And I smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a tight, wounded, holding it together smile. A real one, actually, because something landed in my chest in that exact moment that I hadn't expected. Something quiet and certain, the way a door closing sounds final even when no one slams it. Blake, sitting 2 seats down, glanced at me. He didn't laugh. He looked away quickly, the way people do when they've witnessed something they don't want to be associated with. Gabrielle didn't notice. She was still basking in Chelsea's reaction, the two of them sharing a look that excluded everyone at the table, including the person the comment was about. I set my champagne glass down slowly. I didn't say anything. I didn't defend myself. Didn't ask what she meant. Didn't laugh along to dissolve the tension. Didn't look around to gauge how many people had heard. I just sat with it. And somewhere inside the part of me that had spent 2 years trying to be what Gabrielle needed, something quietly, permanently let go. I didn't know it then. I couldn't have. But that sentence would become the last thing she ever said to me as my girlfriend. The reception carried on. The band played something slow and celebratory. Miranda and her new husband were cutting cake near the far end of the room, and people were drifting toward them with phones raised. The lights were warm. The flowers on the table were white and expensive looking. Everything around me was exactly what a wedding reception is supposed to be. And I sat there for exactly 11 more minutes. I know because I checked my watch when I made the decision, the way you timestamp something you know you'll want to remember clearly later. Then I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked calmly to where Miranda and her husband were standing near the cake table. I congratulated them. I meant it. Miranda looked genuinely happy, the kind of happy that has nothing to do with the flowers or the venue. And I shook her husband's hand and told him he was a lucky man, and I believed that too. Then I walked to the exit. No announcement. No dramatic pause at the door. No final look back across the room to see if Gabrielle was watching. I just left. And if you're wondering why I was so calm, why there was no confrontation, no argument, no public scene to match the public humiliation she'd just handed me in front of people we both knew, it's because I finally understood something I'd been too close to see for 2 years. She hadn't just insulted me in front of Chelsea. She'd shown me exactly who she was, exactly what she thought of me, exactly how little she'd been hiding it. And that kind of clarity doesn't make you angry. It just makes you leave. The comment at the table wasn't the beginning of it. It was just the one that finally landed. The evening had started well enough. We'd arrived together, and Gabrielle had been warm and social the way she always was in public, laughing easily, touching my arm when she introduced me to people, moving through the room with the comfort of someone completely at home in her own extended family. But somewhere around the second hour, when the dinner plates had been cleared and the wine had been flowing for a while, something shifted. It started small. Chelsea made a joke about a guy she'd briefly dated who worked in middle management, and Gabrielle laughed and added, "God, I know the type," with a sideways glance at me that I pretended not to catch. Then someone at the table, I think it was one of Miranda's college friends, a woman named Tara who I'd never met before, asked what I did for work. I told her honestly. I was in financial consulting, building toward independent wealth management, still early in the trajectory, but moving. Gabrielle cut in before I finished. He means he works at a mid-level firm and has a lot of plans. She smiled when she said it. The kind of smile that means she's performing something for the table, not talking to me. Tara smiled back politely and changed the subject. Chelsea snorted quietly into her wine. I kept my face neutral, reached for my glass, said nothing. 20 minutes later, Blake had brought up something about a startup acquisition he'd read about, and the conversation drifted toward ambition. People who'd taken risks, people who'd built things, people who'd bet on themselves early and won. And Gabrielle had leaned toward Chelsea, voice low but not low enough, and said it. "I can't believe I ever thought you had potential." The laugh that followed was real. Chelsea found it genuinely funny. And the two of them shared that look, satisfied, conspiratorial, while I sat 2 feet away and held a champagne glass and chose, for the last time, not to make a scene at someone else's wedding. What I remember most clearly from those final minutes at the table is Miranda, the bride, Gabrielle's own cousin. Miranda had been moving through the room greeting guests, and she'd looped back to our table just in time to catch the tail end of it. Chelsea still laughing, Gabrielle still smirking, and me sitting there with a stillness that must have read on my face as something, because Miranda looked at me, then looked at Gabrielle, and her smile tightened in a way that wasn't about happiness. She was uncomfortable. The bride, at her own reception, was uncomfortable because of what her cousin had just said to the person who'd come as her guest. That registered somewhere. I stood up maybe 10 minutes after that, and when I made my way to Miranda and her husband, she hugged me a little longer than a casual wedding guest hug, and said, quietly, near my ear, "You didn't deserve that." I told her congratulations again, and that I hoped she had a beautiful life. And then I left. Gabrielle didn't come after me. That was the part that settled it completely. Not the comment, not the laugh, not Chelsea's satisfied grin. It was the silence that followed my exit. The absolute absence of any movement in my direction. She didn't follow. She didn't text within the first 5 minutes. She didn't ask Blake or Paige to check on me. She just let me walk out. And that told me everything about how much she'd been present in this relationship compared to how much she'd simply been occupying it. The drive home was quiet. No music. Windows down. Late spring air and the particular silence of a decision that's already been made. I wasn't angry. I was done. She called the next morning at 10:14. I know the time because I'd been up since 6, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, and I'd watched the hours pass with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I answered. "You just left," she said. Not upset, exactly. More confused. The way someone sounds when a situation didn't follow the expected script. "I did," I said, without saying anything to me. I said goodbye to Miranda. A pause. Then, "I think you're being really sensitive about a comment that was obviously just a joke." There it was. I didn't argue with her. Didn't replay the moment. Didn't ask her to imagine how it felt to be the subject of that joke at a table full of people we both knew. I just said, "I don't think it was a joke. I was with Chelsea. We were just talking. You were talking about me. While I was sitting next to you." Another pause. Longer this time. "You've always been like this," she said, and her voice shifted into something I recognized. The tone she used when she was about to reframe a situation so that my reaction became the problem. "You take everything so personally. You can't just relax and have fun." "Gabrielle," I said. "What? What kind of life do you actually want?" She didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, I heard the truth she'd been circling for months without ever quite landing on. So I helped her land on it. "You want more than what I have right now. You want someone with more status, more visibility, more money, probably sooner than I'm able to offer it. And you've been embarrassed by the gap between where I am and where you want your life to look for a while now. Maybe you didn't say it directly, but you said it last night." Quiet. Then, "I never said it was about money. You didn't have to." I could hear her breathing. Somewhere behind her, a television was on. "So what are you saying?" she said finally. "I'm saying we're done. I'm saying this clearly, without anger, and I want you to know I'm not saying it to hurt you or to punish you for last night. I'm saying it because last night was honest, and I'd rather have honesty than continue something that's been quietly falling apart for months." "You're going to regret this," she said. Not angry. Certain. The way people say things when they believe them completely. "Maybe," I said. "But I don't think so." We didn't speak again after that. No drawn-out goodbye, no circling back, no week of ambiguous texts. I ended the call and sat with the quiet of my apartment, and it felt, genuinely, like the first clean breath I'd taken in longer than I could account for. Within 3 weeks, Gabrielle was posting pictures with someone new. His name was Mason. I found out through Paige, who told me not because she was trying to hurt me, but because she seemed uncertain how I'd take it and wanted me to hear it from someone who wasn't gleeful about it. I told Paige I appreciated her telling me, and that I was fine. And I was. Mason had the things Gabrielle had wanted. That was clear within the first few weeks of posts. He drove a car I recognized as expensive from 20 feet away in a photograph. He wore the right brands without trying to signal that he wore the right brands, which is its own kind of signal. He had the kind of jaw and posture and easy social confidence that photographs well, and Gabrielle photographed next to him like someone who had arrived somewhere she'd been trying to get to for a long time. Rooftop dinners. Weekend trips with geotags I recognized as the kinds of places that require either money or knowing the right people to access. Captions that weren't quite humble brags, but weren't quite not. I didn't follow her. I saw the posts through Page occasionally, or through the ambient social media osmosis that happens when you share enough mutual connections with someone. I didn't seek them out, but I didn't completely avoid them either, at first, because I'm human and I'd been with this woman for 2 years, and the part of me that still processed that relationship needed somewhere to put its conclusions. What I noticed was this. She looked happy in the way that people look happy when they're performing happiness for an audience that includes their ex. Maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe it was real, but I noticed it. What I also noticed was that mutual friends, people like Blake, and a guy named Derek who I'd known since college, had started mentioning Mason in conversation in ways that seemed designed to benchmark me against him. Not cruelly, just casually, the way people do when they've absorbed a social comparison and started using it as a reference point. Mason just got promoted to regional director. Mason and Gabrielle went to Napa last weekend. Apparently the winery was insane. Heard Mason's company is about to close a pretty big round. I listened. I said things like, good for them, and sounds fun, and let the comparisons land without reacting to them. And then I went back to work. Because while Gabrielle was building a life that looked successful in photographs, something was starting to move in mine that had nothing to do with how it looked from the outside. Qley had been in my professional orbit for about 4 months when it shifted from orbit to something more direct. He was 15 years ahead of me in the industry. Wealth management, financial strategy, the kind of career that people in our field referenced when they were talking about what was actually possible if you built it correctly. He was consulting with the firm I was working through at the time, and we'd crossed paths enough times in meetings and hallways that he'd formed some impression of me I wasn't fully aware of. One afternoon he stopped by my desk, looked at the framework I'd been building for a client restructuring project, and said, simply, "You think differently than most people here." I thanked him. He said, "I mean it as information, not a compliment. I want to have a real conversation with you sometime." That conversation happened 3 days later over coffee, and it lasted 2.5 hours. And somewhere inside that conversation, a door opened. The thing about real growth is that it looks like nothing from the outside for a very long time. There's no montage, no clean turning point where difficulty becomes momentum. It's months of early mornings and late nights and small decisions that nobody acknowledges because nobody's watching yet, and the only person who knows whether you're actually building something or just exhausting yourself is you. And even you aren't sure, some days. Qley became something between a mentor and a collaborator over the following months. He didn't do it the way mentorship gets romanticized. No speeches, no formal declarations. He just started including me in conversations I hadn't been included in before, sending me frameworks and asking my reaction, challenging my thinking in ways that were uncomfortable but never dismissive. "You're still thinking about protecting yourself from failure instead of engineering for success," he told me once, reviewing a strategy I'd spent 3 weeks building. Those aren't the same thing. No, one is defensive. The other is construction. You're still mostly playing defense. I rebuilt the strategy. The project Qley had first flagged me for was a financial education initiative, a platform that combined wealth-building strategy with accessible content for people who'd never had access to that kind of guidance. It sounds simple when described like that. The execution was not simple. There were months where the technology wasn't cooperating. Months where the funding partnership I thought we had turned out to be conditional on outcomes we hadn't yet reached. A window in late summer where the entire framework felt like it was collapsing from 3 directions simultaneously, and I sat in my apartment at 2 in the morning looking at a spreadsheet that told me we were 4 weeks from having to walk away from the whole thing. Jared was the only person I told about that night. He'd been my closest friend for years, not in the industry, just someone who'd known me long enough to track the full arc of things. He came over, brought food I didn't ask for, sat across from me at that kitchen table, and said, "What do you need right now?" Not, "It'll work out." Not, "You've got this." Just, "What do you need?" I told him I needed someone to sit there while I figured it out. He stayed until almost 4. We found the path forward somewhere around 3:15, a restructuring of the funding model that I dismissed early on as too complex but turned out, when I looked at it again with fresh exhaustion and no ego, to be exactly right. The next 6 months were different. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. Not easier, but different. The kind of different where effort starts compounding instead of just accumulating. The platform launched to a small audience and performed better than projected. Then better than that. Then a financial media outlet picked up a piece on what we were building, and the piece got shared further than any of us expected, and suddenly the conversations I was having were with people at a level I hadn't had access to 6 months earlier. Qley looked at the traction data one morning and said, quietly, "They're going to ask you to speak." I didn't know who they were yet. I found out in November. Paige told me things without meaning to. Not gossip exactly. She wasn't that kind of person. But she was connected to both sides of what had been my life. And occasionally when we crossed paths, she'd say something that landed in my awareness like a small stone dropping into still water. The first time I noticed that something was shifting in Gabrielle's life, it was something Paige said offhandedly about Mason being a lot to deal with. I didn't ask her to elaborate. But a month later she mentioned that Gabrielle had seemed tired lately, the kind of tired that isn't physical. And then, a month after that, in a conversation about something else entirely, Paige said, "I think she thought it was going to be different." That was all she said. I didn't ask what she meant, but I understood it. Mason, from what filtered through over time, had turned out to be the kind of person who looked excellent from the exact distance at which Gabrielle had first encountered him. Up close, in the daily texture of an actual relationship, he was apparently something other than what the photograph suggested. Controlling, someone said once, in a context I only half caught. The kind of person who needed to be the most important person in any room he occupied, including rooms that were supposed to belong to other people. The trips continued. The posts continued. The aesthetic of the life she'd chosen remained carefully maintained. But Paige told me, once, that Gabrielle had mentioned being lonely. I sat with that for a minute. Not with satisfaction. Not with vindication. With something closer to sadness, actually, because 2 years together means something regardless of how it ends. And I'd never wanted her to be unhappy, even after what happened at the wedding. What I also noticed, and this I learned not from Paige, but from the particular digital footprint that people leave when they're quietly monitoring someone they've lost track of, was that Gabrielle had started paying attention to my professional presence online. The article that had run in the fall had been shared widely enough that it had a real search footprint. Someone who knew my name and was looking for it would find it easily. And I knew, from the platform metrics that tracked referral sources, that the article had been accessed multiple times from a location that correlated with Gabrielle's neighborhood. She was watching. I didn't reach out, didn't reference it, didn't change anything about what I was doing or how I was moving forward. But I knew. And then, 6 weeks before the summit, a short profile piece on the initiative ran in a national financial publication, the kind with enough credibility that it shows up in people's feeds even when they aren't looking for it. Paige texted me after it ran. "Saw the article. Really proud of you." Then, 15 minutes later, a second text. "I think Gabrielle saw it too." I thanked Paige for the first message and didn't respond to the second. There was nothing to say about it yet. The email came on a Tuesday. National Wealth Summit. Annual conference, sold out. Held at a convention arena in the city. The kind of event that draws industry leaders, media, high net worth attendees, and the particular category of ambitious professional who understands that proximity to that room is worth the ticket price alone. They were inviting me to speak. Not as a panelist. Not as a secondary presenter on an afternoon breakout session. As a featured speaker. Main stage. One of 4 people chosen from across the industry to anchor the central program. I read the email 3 times. Then I called Qley. He picked up on the second ring, and when I told him, he said, "I know. I may have put your name in front of the right people. You could have told me you were doing that." "I could have," he agreed cheerfully. "But then you would have been anxious about it for months, and it might have affected your work. This way you just found out now, and you're only anxious about it for 6 weeks. I laughed. First genuine laugh I could remember in a while. Jared's response, when I told him that evening, was to show up at my apartment the next morning with coffee and a handshake that turned into a hug, and to say, "I always knew. I just didn't know when." I sat with the invitation for 2 days before I responded. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to sit with what it meant. Not the career milestone, not the platform, not the audience of several thousand people, but what it meant in the quieter, more personal register of my own story. 11 months earlier, I'd sat at a table at Miranda's wedding reception and heard the woman I loved tell her friend that she couldn't believe she'd ever thought I had potential. And I'd smiled and congratulated the newlyweds and left without drama. And now here was the answer to that sentence, arriving not as revenge, but as fact. I didn't think about Gabrielle when I wrote back to confirm. I thought about Cole, who had seen something in me before I could see it clearly myself. About Jared, sitting at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning while I rebuilt a funding model from scratch. About all the early mornings and the framework that had failed and been rebuilt, and the article that had surprised me with how far it traveled. I thought about the version of myself who had sat at that table and chosen not to argue, not because he was defeated, but because he already knew, somewhere beneath the hurt, that the argument wasn't the point. The work was the point. And in 6 weeks, I would stand on a stage in front of several thousand people, and the work would speak for itself. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Gabrielle had already bought a ticket to the summit. The convention arena held just under 4,000 people, and by the time the morning session began, it was close to full. I arrived through a side entrance with Cole and 2 members of the event coordination team, bypassing the main floor, and I spent the first 90 minutes in a green room that smelled like fresh coffee and dry erase markers, reviewing my notes, doing the specific kind of breathing that Cole had once told me was the difference between channeling nerves and being controlled by them. The arena was the kind of space that has its own energy independent of the people inside it. High ceilings, production lighting, the particular hum of a crowd that knows it's there to witness something worth witnessing. Giant screens flanking the main stage, displaying the summit branding in clean, authoritative design. From backstage, I could hear the audience settling, the sound of several thousand people finding their seats, and the ambient electricity that comes from that collective anticipation. I didn't know she was there. Gabrielle had arrived with Chelsea. I learned this later, pieced together from Paige, who had also attended the summit professionally, and from a conversation that would happen after the event. But in those backstage minutes, I was entirely elsewhere in my focus, entirely inside the work, inside the 11 months that had brought me to this particular green room on this particular morning. The first speaker went up at 9, the second at 10:15. The host took the stage at 11:45 to introduce the third speaker of the main program. The arena went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happens when a crowd of thousands settles into focused attention simultaneously. On the main floor, Gabrielle was sitting in row 14 with Chelsea beside her. She'd come for the summit's programming on wealth strategy. She'd been increasingly interested in financial independence since things with Mason had started fraying, and the summit had been recommended by someone in her professional network. She was not expecting to know anyone on that stage. The host spoke for 3 minutes, setting context, building the introduction, establishing the significance of the work being presented. The kind of introduction that has weight to it, that communicates before the speaker even appears that what comes next is worth the undivided attention of 4,000 people. Then the host said my name. The screens lit up simultaneously. My name, my photo, my work, my trajectory. All of it rendered in the large, unambiguous, unmistakable language of a main stage convention screen at a national summit. The arena responded with the immediate, full-throated applause of an audience that had been primed for this moment and was releasing its anticipation into it. Gabrielle heard the name at the same moment the screens changed. Paige, who was seated 3 rows behind her, told me later that she watched it happen in real time. Watched Gabrielle's head come up from her phone with the particular sharp attention of someone who has heard something that doesn't compute. Watched her eyes find the screen. Watched the recognition move across her face in stages. Disbelief first. Then the slow, dawning comprehension of what she was looking at. Then something that Paige described, quietly, as the look of someone doing math they don't want to finish. Chelsea had turned toward Gabrielle, who wasn't moving. Chelsea looked at the screen, looked back at Gabrielle, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. The screen was saying everything. I walked out to the stage. For 1,000 people in a sold-out arena, applauding. Cole was somewhere in that crowd. Jared was in the back section, standing, which I would find out later because he texted me a photo from where he'd been standing. I found the center of the stage and I looked out at the audience and I felt, with a completeness that surprised me, exactly like myself. Not performing, not proving anything, not speaking to any ghost in the crowd or settling any score. Just there, just the work. I spoke for 41 minutes. I talked about what we'd built, what we'd learned, what we believed was possible for people who'd never been given access to the kind of financial guidance that changes the trajectory of a life. I talked about failure in the specific, unromantic way that Cole had taught me was more useful than any success story. I talked about the moment at 2 in the morning with the spreadsheet, without naming Jared, but knowing he was in the back of the room. The audience was with me in the way that audiences sometimes are, genuinely, completely, the kind of presence that you can feel from the stage as a specific quality of collective attention that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with truth. When I finished, the arena stood up. All of it. And somewhere in row 14, Gabrielle stood too, because it would have been more conspicuous not to, and applauded for the man she had told her friend she couldn't believe she'd ever thought had potential. She found me 40 minutes after the session ended. I was in the corridor just off the main floor, past the exhibition area, near the side hall that led back toward the green rooms, talking with 2 attendees who'd had questions after my session. I'd been stopped 8 or 9 times on the way there, which was still new enough to feel surreal, and Cole was somewhere behind me speaking to a journalist. I saw her before she reached me. She was alone. Chelsea was nowhere visible. She was moving toward me with the specific, deliberate walk of someone who has made a decision that took courage to make and is now committed to following through before the courage runs out. I finished my conversation, shook 2 hands, and turned to face her. Gabrielle looked, I want to say this without cruelty, because that's not what this moment was, like someone who had arrived somewhere and discovered the map she'd been using was wrong. Not broken, not undone, just recalibrated. The way faces look when a person is processing a significant revision to a story they thought they knew. Hi, she said. Hi, Gabrielle. I didn't know you were going to be here. I know, I said. She looked at me for a moment. There was something behind her eyes that I recognized as the effort of someone trying to find the right language for something that doesn't have clean language. You were, she started and stopped. Thank you, I said. Simple, direct, not sarcastic. She nodded. Then, can we talk? We're talking. I mean, she paused. I mean about everything. I looked at her. I gave the question real consideration, because she deserved that, because 2 years is real, and what we'd had before it unraveled had been real, and she was standing in front of me not as an antagonist, but as a person who was sorting through something difficult. I don't think there's a conversation left to have, I said. Not because I'm angry with you. I'm not. But I think everything that needed to be said was said 11 months ago, and everything that didn't get said. I gestured, slightly, at the corridor around us, at the residue of the room we'd both just been in, got said another way. Her jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, with the effort of not crying in a public corridor, which I recognized and quietly respected. I said something cruel to you at Miranda's wedding, she said. You did. I've thought about it a lot. I believe you. She looked at me, and I looked back at her, and there was a long, quiet moment in which everything that needed to pass between us passed without either of us saying it. I think I wanted you to be smaller than you were, she said finally. It was easier. I nodded. I understood that. I understood it more than she probably expected me to. I hope things get better for you, I said. I mean that. She blinked, looked down briefly, then back up. Nodded once. Okay, she said. Take care of yourself. And I walked back toward the exhibition floor, where Cole was waiting and Jared had finally made his way down from the back section, and 2 people from a media outlet wanted 10 minutes if I had them. I didn't look back. Not because I was making a point, just because there was nothing back there that belonged to the direction I was going. 11 months earlier, she had laughed at my potential in front of people we both knew, at a table in a reception hall where someone else was celebrating the best day of their life. Now she was standing in a corridor of a sold-out national arena, staring at the proof that my potential had never needed her belief to become real. It had just needed time, and I had given it exactly that.